big architectural practice and with the biggest conservation practice in the country. We work on some of the country's best loved buildings, from St Paul's to, not the country's best loved buildings, but Scott's Hut in Antarctica. We also do quite a lot of contemporary architecture in a historic context. This is a new residence centre for artists at Dillington House in Somerset, which is a Grade 1 listed building. Design is a very difficult thing to talk about, and you soon get into debates, as we will in this session, about what design is. But there's a bit of a preconception that design things are things that are for rich people and developed Western economies. In other words, that design is perhaps a bit superfluous to the real primary needs of people. I don't accept that, but it is a thought people have. You'll know what good design is. I do an exercise at Purcell where I go around talking about design, and we have a questionnaire. Everybody knows it. I don't need to tell you. You can walk into a space and know whether it's a nice space, an enjoyable space, a relaxing space, whether it's unfriendly and threatening. Those characteristics are inherent in the design quality. And equally, I probably don't need to tell you that there's actually loads of research done on design, and it's fairly clear that design and the space created with good design can have an elevating effect on people's lives, their health, their well-being, and all those things. So it's a pretty fundamental part of our existence. I'm just going to stop there for a minute, this bit about the delight, design and the delight of places. This is a project for Farm City children. They provide week-long farm holidays for children from very deprived inner city areas. Sorry, they're not holidays, the children go to work the farm. They're between the age of 7 and 11. It's run by Michael Bolgar, and it's right, you probably know where it was. Our brief on this project, which is to convert a Grade 2 star listed farm complex in West Wales, from the client was very, very specific. They said to us, the children come here on the bus. It's probably the first time they've ever been away from home. It's certainly the first time they've been to the country. And it would be the first time they've ever seen a cow. When they get here, we've got to get them settled and happy, comfortable in their environment within seconds of them arriving. So we want your design to welcome them and engross them into the place. We only have a week to change their lives. We don't want a week trying to discipline them before we can start work. So our design approach was about trying to put value into everything that we did. We could have gone, this is a list of all, we could have gone down to Bolton and Paul and bought a standard window and put it in there. But it wouldn't have achieved what we were trying to achieve. Instead, we built a window that was like a little house, sort of 7 to 11-year-olds. We made it so that a child could sit in it, could read in it, could look out across the landscape that they're seeing for the first time. We did everything we could, not to make it a piece of in-your-face architecture, but to make it a welcoming space that achieved what the client wanted. So the design is not just about delivering big things, it's about delivering quite sensitive little things. I like these 3 quotes. To me, they encapsulate the issues around design. Firstly, design isn't what something looks like or feels like, it's how it works. That's Steve Jobs, you know what he does, don't you? Those things we did. The next one, we use design thinking to balance desirability, functionality, feasibility, and viability. When we do that, we create value. Creating value in the world that we're talking about, and trying to deal with giving historic buildings that are threatened in the future, is really, really important. And that's not just financial value, it's the value in the community of that asset. How many times when you've got a derelict building will you have heard somebody say, oh, it's an eyesore, knock it down? That's a function of the loss of value. And it's a really interesting part of the process when you repair it, how that value picture changes. And then lastly, really surprising from Sir Norman Foster, he says, architects design for the present with an awareness of the past for a future which is essentially unknown. That seems surprisingly subtle. So why does it matter in terms of conservation? Well, first of all, the process of design facilitates change. It allows you to take a building for which the uses have disappeared, which might therefore not be particularly convenient for the new uses you want to put in. It allows you to change it. It allows you, the process allows you to adapt it. It changes perceptions. I just talked about that a moment ago. a good design to a good historic building, put it all back together, changes people's value of it. They suddenly start getting engaged with it. It improves viability and sustainability. It's very, very important these days to remember that, you know, one of the reasons these buildings, we have, you know, 1,500 buildings at risk on the register, is that because they've lost their viability. They no longer have uses that generate the revenue either to keep them in good repair or to repair them. So if we are able to get them over that hump, get them back in repair, they've got to wash their face afterwards. Otherwise, you'll be back where you started in 10 years' time. Obviously, the environment today is a great issue, but also a better building environment will improve its operational capacity. You can get people in and out of it easier if you provide disabled access. And then lastly, the purpose of the design process in the context of buildings is ultimately to protect and care for the thing that you're having the design to. You're looking after a historic building. I'm just going to talk through some projects. This is Arnesdale Cemetery in Bristol, and I'm going to talk about this building here, which is called the Nonconformist Chapel. Arnesdale was the first Act of Parliament cemetery built outside London in 1832. Very little bit of history. Up till 1832, if you died, you got buried in the churchyard. But as people migrated into the cities, the churchyards filled. And in the early 1800s, there were terrible outbreaks of cholera and typhus, which people realised were primarily arising out of the issues of burying in churchyards in urban areas. So the Victorians and true Thatcherite spirit said, well, we'll have private companies. They can set up cemeteries. If you think about it, a new place to bury people was involved. So it was the architect who came along, how would you design it? And at Arnesdale, they took the view that, well, we'll design an Arcadian Greek landscape, because that's what in our mind heaven looks like, and we'll populate it with temples. So what survives at Arnesdale is a sort of Greek landscape, planted to the middle of Bristol, with a series of temples in it. It has about 500,000 burials, and the place had fallen into huge dereliction, because once the cemetery is full, it's got no way of regenerating itself. The owner thought that it was worth millions for a housing development. How he was going to dig up all the bodies, I don't know. So it's very extensive. The chapel we're going to talk about is there. Beautiful landscape. The landscape's listed grade 1 and the chapel's grade 2. All of these projects are projects undertaken by third sector organisations, the ones I'm showing you. What that means is that these people who took the bull by the horns and started agitating for Arnesdale ended up doing a £12 million scheme. I actually gave them £1 to buy the cemetery, so I can stand here and say I bought Arnesdale Cemetery. And it cost £1, but it cost £12.5 million to do all the repairs and to get the landscape back into good repair. So, you know, there's a very important link between the quality of the asset, the determination of the third sector group doing it, and how it gets delivered and the end result. This is the Nonconformist Chapel, and as you can see, the original building, which is this thing, was a single, simple, open space. It was just a chapel. In 1923, Arnesdale, this chapel was converted to a crematorium, so they excavated a huge area out to the west of it, and they put a catafalque in that the coffin goes down into the cellars. In terms of our design for the reuse, we didn't want to subdivide the original chapel space. It was becoming it's a performance and education venue. And we had to provide loos, we had to provide places for people to hang their coats up. In addition, all the crematorium equipment was down below. It's actually quite interesting. And we wanted to provide public access to that and use that as an asset. So we were faced with the situation of how do we use that building, get people down below, and not damage it. And our solution was to add a very simple glazed box on the outside on a raised terrace, which gave us the opportunity to create disabled access, reorientated the building entrance, and that of course was, below that was all the cemetery equipment, and then we put in new stairs, new lift, and made access and entrance through. So quite significant design changes to the original cellular historic building. This is the basement. See, these are the cremators, and loos went down there, storage, kitchens, that sort of thing. So, as I say, it's quite significant. We designed the building as a really simple glass box. We chose not to go down the route of trying to extend it in a style that matched the original. That wouldn't achieve the objectives that we were doing. So what we tried to do is to make the glass box relate or resonate with the existing. So the spacing of the columns directly follows things like the spacing of the pilasters on the buildings. And the building was very transparent, so it could be lit as a beacon at night, because the cemeteries use a lot of that. Internally, we use the cellar spaces. This is one of the original 1923 cremators. There's a sign as you go down saying, "Don't come down here if you're going to faint." So the words to that effect, 'cause it's quite scary. But what it did do was it left us the original chapel building unaffected, unsubdivided, and usable, and with all the facilities that it needs. So, what did our creative, inventive, we like to think, design do for Armless Vale? Well, as I said, let the principal space remain undivided. It created the ability to use the building flexibly. People walking the cemetery could use the loos without disturbing the occupants of the chapel. And likewise, people could go and visit the cremators and the exhibition down there without doing that. So that's quite important, that independent access. It allowed multiple users at the same time, so you get more people using it, more people use it, more income. Provided the supporting facilities, sanitary, catering, provided an external space. The cemetery has lots of guided walks, and the terrace now is a place where people meet to go off on their guided walks. It got us DDA compliant access, and because of the increase of use, it provided us with operational viability and long-term sustainability. And because of all those things, it gave us better access to funding. We were able to tick more boxes. One thing I didn't mention earlier in my previous presentation is that the most interesting thing for me about this project is that the business plans had all sorts of income streams. When it opened, weddings started happening in the cemetery. It wasn't mentioned in the business plan. And that's about perceptions changing. People no longer saw it as a place to bury people. They saw it as a much wider thing. And so weddings are now a fundamental part of their income. And when you think about it, the buildings are nice, the landscape nice, and Granny's at the wedding, although she died 10 years ago, she's just buried at the wedding. So, quite important. This is Cromford Mills, Richard Arkwright's first factory, built in the 1770s. Grade 1 listed, phenomenally important buildings and location. And we are nearly completed on this building, which is building 17, which is a 5-storey mill. Follows what turned out to be a fairly similar pattern in that most mills of this sort are about 8 to 10 metres wide, about 40 to 50 metres long, and a large open space to lay out the machines and things. In this case, the mill had been extended. In addition, there's an area here where in the 1920s a lift had been put in, so the floor had been removed. Now, we had quite a long debate, a bit stronger than that, if there was someone from the English Heritage here, about how to subdivide them. The English Heritage wanted us to keep the replica stair. It didn't comply with building regs, so we've had to rebuild it anyway. And rather than subdivide the space in the middle, they wanted us to put a new stair at the end, somewhere where there wasn't a stair, so we're going to have to chop out 1772 for beams, plus a whole section floor. Because of fire escape and the limitation on directions of escape, we had to, on that solution, link the two stairs with a protected corridor. So along the whole length of the building, we had to put a fireproof corridor. In terms of design, we were looking at it and we realised that we could meet the escape distance requirements by putting a single stair in the middle of the plan. And it seemed very logical to us. It was particularly logical because the floor had already been removed in a large part of this, and it left the building pretty much open, and if we put glass walls around the staircase, you'd still have the same rigidity. But we had a hell of a row doing it. Eventually we were able to get planning consent. But the issue here is what's actually happened. I'll show you this was the images that we provided for the planning application. You can see the insertion of the staircase really doesn't detract from the space. And here is the building as it is today. It's not quite finished. The contractors are still on site, so this scaffold there. But you can see the insertion of the staircase doesn't really reduce the legibility of the space. But what it did deliver was this, which is really, really important. By being clever in your design, you don't just add value in terms of making a nicer place, you add real value. our proposal relative to the English Heritage one increased the nettable floor rent by 19%. The upper floors were let as offices. That increased the potential rent per year by £20,000. It's a lot of money. If you capitalise it, it increases the value, not makes the value, but increases the value by 340,000. And because we were only putting one staircase in, not two, and no corridor, it reduced the construction cost by around 85,000. So in the long run, it improved viability, it improved spatial quality, it actually reduced the amount of historic fabric that would have to be lost because of the works. It reduced the funding requirement, which helped, but also it allowed some of that funding to be transferred to other things that the Trust wanted to do. So in other words, design isn't just what it looks like, it's the net effect and what the outcome that you get at the end of the day. This project called Highcliffe Castle in Dorset, Grade 1 listed building, built by Lord Stuart de Rothesay, first Marquess of Bute, whose grandson did the work at Cardiff Castle with, what's his name? Famous Boris Burgess, and had obviously visited this place. Built out of bits that he brought back in the early 1800s from buildings that were sacked in the French Revolution and other bits that he found. Put together an amazing concoction, but sadly it became very derelict, suffered from a series of major fires throughout the 60s until the council bought it in 1970 for the Queen's Jubilee in 1967. As you can see from the photograph, completely and utterly derelict. This isn't a very good photograph, but that was what the interior looked like before. Very, very elaborate. Wonderful glasswork brought from Italy, plasterwork and marble carvings on the doors, fantastic interior. We did about 7 phases, putting the external fabric back into good repair. Very challenging, cost about £9 million. At the end of that process, the building was beautifully repaired, looked lovely from the outside, but inside was still completely empty and derelict, with none of that interior. Once the fabric repairs had been finished, the council and the friends of Highcliffe Castle started letting people in to see the building and walking around it. And people enjoyed seeing the building in the state it was. It was fascinating to them, because they could read it as a piece of archaeology and see its story. When we were commissioned to get on and get the first phase of the work done to reuse the castle, the brief to us was quite specific. The client didn't want to lose that feel of what the interior was like in its reduced state. So we developed a very simple set of design solutions. This is our approach to doors. The doors were simple planes. They were set out from the walls so that they were like screens. The theory being that if you could put them in that easily, you could take them out. So the thing would be reversible if you ever wanted to put the original materials down. And then the rest of the walls, this is actually in that panel room that you saw in the photograph of. So all that plasterwork has just got completely destroyed. And also, in terms of circulation, we designed things so that, for example, you could see the space going up. You could still see the amazing three-dimensional qualities that the building had as a ruin. If you imagine taking the floor out of the building, you've got a 3.5–4-story building. The spaces upwards are really intelligent. It was designed, interesting, it was designed as a sort of kit of parts so that the council could then, once they finished the first bit, they could progressively and incrementally go ahead and do the rest. So here, the design strategy had a quite different intent to, for example, Convent Mills. Here we were most anxious that you could see what was new and what was old, so that you could do this reductive thing in the future. It left the castle legible to visitors. They could see the story. They could see that it had been burned out by fire and all those issues. Importantly, it brought the building back into use to its keep, and it allowed the opportunity in the future, if you ever were to raise money, to do the full restoration. We resolve issues like accessibility, the incremental development of the castle in the future. For big conservation projects, it's often very difficult to get all the money to do it all at once. So thinking in design terms about how you might finish it off over an extended set of phases is quite important. Your strategy has to work for all those phases, and your detail has to be replicable. So that's the benefits from Highcliffe. So for you, doing third sector projects, does design matter? And I think this is why it does. Your projects will all be high profile. conservation of buildings at risk is an important activity. They're an exemplar for other people. The number of times I meet a new client and the first thing we do almost is to go and see where people have done it well elsewhere, and also badly elsewhere, because we've done that too. So you're doing an exemplar. You're doing these things to improve your community. If you repair a historic building in a rundown area, it will impact on that community through regenerating it, bringing jobs, bringing civic pride, all those sorts of things. You're doing it, you've got to add value and make it sustainable. The funders are not going to give you £5–6 million and 5 years down the line you're going to close because it's bankrupt, because it doesn't work. So it's absolutely essential. And you have to track funding. And then lastly, it's really important, these projects, that you engage the local community in ownership. Community and consultation are often talked about as if they're a drag and a pain, and go consult community. But actually, it's really innovative. It's really good fun if you do it properly and creatively. So don't shy. So, because your project matters to you and to everyone else, you've also got to choose the right architects and your design team. I'm not going to dwell on that, but it's a really important part of the process. And the procurement of architects these days, with European legislation on the single market and fairness in tendering, is an absolute nightmare. So make sure you get it right. And if you do get it right, good luck with your project. Thank you.
I want to really talk about decisions about context. Biljana's asked me to talk about the wider context of building. I'm going to talk about an existing wall in Northern Ireland and a staircase in the middle of London in order to try and accentuate 2 points in relation to that. You might not be dealing with maybe this level of broad context, but we are very interested in, if you like, how to sort of activate sustainability, because everyone talks about it, but I think there are some very, very simple things you can do. And one of the things is to do some basic asset mapping. So if you start off with studying the positive attributes of natural capital, social capital, financial capital, and then last but not least, built capital, you will find some amazing things about the context of your building or the context of the place you're in, and obviously the history of the site will often come through what it was before any building was there at all. So I think, sustainability is a word that's used, but there's some very practical things one can do to asset map any particular place. Community consultation is something that we carry out for every scale of project, from a town centre regeneration all the way through to a single building. Obviously, one has to make the level of consultation appropriate to the scale of the project, because you don't want to be bringing out the whole town for a sort of toilet extension. But nevertheless, and you need to find out if people have been consulted before, because they get sort of over-consultationitis. But nevertheless, as Niall was saying, it's not only good fun, but the important thing about consultation is that it just collects local intelligence. So it helps do your job for you. You very quickly cut to the chase of what's important to people and what's not important, and they will tell you about their place. And really, it becomes a proactive exercise rather than a reactive exercise. So what you really want is conservation officers, people from the heritage sector, transport engineers. You don't want them to be people just telling you what not to do. You want to engage them in a forum where you use their expertise to help you find the right solution for a particular situation. The analogy we use when we're consulting with communities, because it's the one that's easy for people to remember, is sort of like going to see a GP, a general practitioner, who then might refer you to a specialist. But the first thing that a GP would do if you go to them with a particular issue, the first thing they're likely to do is actually listen. They'll ask you, how do you feel? So when you go into a particular community, or you've got neighbours and stakeholders, it's quite important to collate what they say into a sort of hierarchy of needs or wishes. But to do the first thing is listening rather than telling people what to do is quite important. The second thing then is more top-down, and that's, as built environment experts, hopefully people who have something to offer. So the danger with consultation is that you get the community to tell you what the right solution is. Well, that's not fair on the community, because they won't have the same constraints available to them. So you then undertake an examination, which is the technical study of a particular building, situation, context, etc. Then you make a diagnosis. You combine those two things together, all of the facts that you've got by listening your examination, and then you create a diagnosis and then hopefully a remedy which seeks to build on the assets and transform any negatives. Don't bother reading that long list, but the first sort of 2 or 3 are what came out of listening to the local community in this village called Glenarm, north of Belfast. It's on the coastal route up to Giant's Causeway, and it's a very pretty, intact historical village. So it's a little bit down a hill. And what they were telling us is that Glenarm puts its worst foot forwards. Everything around the coastal road is sort of blighted. It's run down, sort of factories, they're falling to bits. Whereas actually when you bother to get inside the village, back into the historic core, it's actually rather beautiful, it's incredibly intact, and it's a very important piece of heritage. So you'd immediately start asking, why is that? Why is it that Glenarm's got this strange phenomenon? So you do the sorts of things that you'd be used to in terms of the wider context here, map regression, understanding where it is, in the context. It's the first of the 9 glens, for instance. It's a valley. They used to export timber before the coastal road was in, eastwards, so over to Scotland. This is the important slide I wanted to focus on, which has a bearing on the wall. And this is, in the 18th century, this was the route, inland route. There wasn't a coastal route going to Belfast and beyond. It was actually, here was the stuff being exported, if you like, over to Scotland. Here's the castle, the route was open in front of the castle. Here's the historic high street and the crossroads. So that's where the dynamics of the place, or the DNA of the place, was on that crossroads, as you might expect. Roll on a good few hundred years, the castle's put up a gate. There's a coastal road that's been put in, which is particularly beautiful. And of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, the original raison d'etre of that place has stopped, because the movement network and the movement economy, if you like, has changed significantly. So what people experience is the sort of industrial heritage, which is on the water side. Now, virtually nobody in the village, experts, tourism people, you name it, everyone who was at that event, this was completely news to everybody. They kind of knew it at heart, but they'd not understood why. And yet it's very, very quick, as you can imagine, a couple of hours to get to those sorts of bits of understanding about the place. So in the village core, on this mini roundabout, this is the coastal route that actually goes past the village, and this is the historical high street that is obviously still there. There's this wall to what was once a small industrial yard, shed, factory. And it's important because it's local stone and it's within the conservation area. So the idea generated with the local community, probably not quite as exaggerated as this, was that space, which currently is completely not used at all, it's just there, should actually be the town square, the village square, because that is the natural, that is the new crossroads of the village, that is the natural gathering space, and that is actually the focus and the heart and the fulcrum of the community. So again, unless, and then obviously there'll be interesting discussions in terms of how that's actually dealt with, probably not as many openings as that, but nevertheless the context of study, the context of engagement with that community is very, very important to add a degree of context, really, to decisions that are being made just about the wall itself, because you can imagine the person protecting the wall is probably unaware of that context. This is the last couple of slides now. Really, this is to make the point of what is the right solution architecturally and stylistically in the 21st century. This is an area I moved a couple of years ago to Lower Holloway, so I started looking at where some interesting buildings were, and this was one, the Marlborough Theatre, which I went in search of. And this is how we view life in the 19th century, I guess, quite civic, grand buildings. This is on the same site now, and this is how we viewed the world more or less post-war. Modernism had taken hold, a very different view of the world, post-industrial revolution and expression of materials, and things being very much of their time. So this is the sort of prevalence of the notion of things needing to be of their time. Quite a at one level, contemporary idea. I'm sure many of you will know about the Athens and Venice Charter, but for those of you that don't, it's a particularly important set of documents that have within it a sort of code which I think has been prevalent in conservation work and in historic work, which is about this idea of all new work bearing a contemporary stamp. So in brackets, at that particular time, because this is written sort of in the 30s and 60s, in that language, contemporary really, one would assume, means modernism at the most part. It means modernism. But of course, given that it's 100 years, or coming up for 100 years, when modernism started, that too is a historical style. So if you're adding a modernist addition to a Victorian or medieval building, one could say that isn't that actually no longer a contemporary stamp of a particular kind. So what do you actually have to do in today's world, in the 21st century, for things to bear a contemporary stamp? The other question is, does anybody actually care, other than historians? And wouldn't they know the difference anyway, just by studying them? So I think this has been studied as a big publication, if anyone's interested, through one of our charities, Inkbow, that drills into this in a great deal of detail. But I think the one thought that I really wanted to leave you with before showing this one example is that I think we're in an age of pluralism, and there's a more sophisticated argument to be had of what is appropriate in terms of an architectural language rather than a style. What is the appropriate language, use of materials in a particular setting? This is a rather extreme example, but nevertheless an important example that's currently being studied at all levels, and we advised at an early stage, and it's a staircase. It's a new staircase that will take you to the Triforium Gallery at Westminster Abbey, which is an incredible space, and the idea is the public will be able to actually get up to the Triforium Gallery and look down the nave of Westminster Abbey, which is going to be spectacular. But when we arrived and we were first consulted, the staircase was a lift with a glass box on the outside, and I think a stone stair, angular, square in form, and very, very alien to the form of the Abbey and the language of the Abbey around the edge. I think we were nervous at that stage that it would be, even though it's small, we probably see that that is actually the form, that's the staircase there that we're talking about. It was so alien to the rest of its surroundings that your eye would have been drawn immediately to it because of its difference, not because of its scale, because of how different it is. And I think in this case, if one talks about these simple principles of commodity, firmness and delight, and usefulness, firmness and delight, there's a sort of, in each situation needs to be a study of what's the hierarchy and symmetry of the existing building. Is the new addition to the building dominant in that hierarchy? In other words, is it something that needs to, in terms of legibility, tell you this is where this is now more important than the existing composition? Or is it something that needs to be subservient to the existing composition of the building? So I think there's a sort of whole decision-making process that falls out of, one, understanding the composition and language of the existing building, and then two, when you're adding to it, what is the appropriate language and move within that composition and hierarchy that you need to then put in place. So I think that's a very quick run through. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Franklin. The opposite end, the practice spectrum to Niall, and I run for the last 37 years a sole principal business that has dealt almost exclusively over that time with hundreds of listed buildings. Curiously enough, not necessarily by choice. You leave the School of Architecture armed with a portfolio of firsts and distinctions, and you think the world is just waiting for you. They don't want that stuff. So you find yourself examining and understanding these extraordinary buildings that we're surrounded by and that people do want to preserve and maintain. And you begin to understand the extraordinary capacities of design and decoration, construction, engineering that those buildings encapsulate. It is absolutely captivating. And I spent 3 years having, first of all, established the first awards system to carry the RIBA initials in South Region, much against the advice of the headquarters. In fact, they managed to shut us down after 10 years. But they have now got a conservation category in the general awards system. At the moment, an architect who wants a conservation award has to go to the RICS, who very kindly host these things and have a marvellous system of conservation awards. But we're getting there. Having had so much difficulty with that, I then handed the conservation group over to a colleague and got myself elected on the National Secret Council in the hope that I would get this thing moved higher up the RIBA agenda. But it's, I don't think I've got enough years left in order to achieve this. Things move at a glacial pace in the RIBA. But the important thing is, I believe, that great architecture of the past is just as important to the institute that all architects, most architects belong to, as great architecture of the present and the future. It's just as important, and it should receive as much coverage. It is a design issue. The RIBA is about design. But all of us, whatever the size of practice or which sector we occupy, those of us that are concerned with old buildings, we have exactly the same passion of ensuring that these buildings continue to have a reason to exist. If a building doesn't have a reason to exist, then it falls into disrepair, like all those things that we've seen in presentations today, until somebody realizes that it's about to be lost, and huge effort, including the amazing support of the PRT, to try and rescue these things and bring them back into use. And beneficial use means change, because the building might no longer have its original function, it needs a new one. And of course change means design. And design to me is just the same whether you're repairing invisibly a stone vault in a cathedral or putting a new building right next to a sensitive site. It's all about design. And the buildings we want to keep, they were designed, and we keep them because they are beautiful. That's what they deserve. The very least we can give them is that respect. And great architecture from the past is not exclusively things that appear in history books, and they're not always designed by architects. And the country is littered with stupendous engineering monuments, some of them designed by amateurs, many of them are what we might call brutally functional, handsome rather than beautiful, or architecturally refined. I was the conservation assessor for the West Midlands region in the RIBA Awards recently, and it was a building of extraordinary industrial monument of extraordinary power and strength, and it had a very simple, brutally simple conversion job done on it, which I thought was appropriate to that setting. But the chairman of the awards group lambasted me on the telephone for not recognizing that it should have had more architectural refinement. How do you put architectural refinement against the roughest and toughest and most pragmatic piece of structure that you could imagine? It didn't seem appropriate. And buildings don't have to be listed in order to be valued, obviously, because there are more than issues of design and historical importance, in other words, important enough to be written about in history, to make them worth keeping. Sustainability, it's about eliminating waste. We don't throw away resources, and a built resource is something that can be used. And it never ceases to amaze me how incredibly disparate groups rapidly come to agreement on what it is of value about a particular building that makes it worth keeping. You know, we all have different opinions, but somehow quality comes through and agreement is reached and things move on. I know they do take ages sometimes, these things, and so many opinions involved, but we do know instinctively, I think sometimes, exactly what it is about building that's worth keeping. There are all kinds of values. I could say cultural, site values, design values, cash values. The cultural ones, there's a certain amount of control and support, of course, from the legislation and the guidelines, following the National Planning Policy Framework that when I was chair of the RIBA group, we spent hundreds of hours plowing through. 1,500 pages of planning law were reduced to 75, and 75 pages of heritage planning law were reduced to 2.5. The interesting thing is, those 2.5 pages actually contain the complete essence of what had been in the 75. All the repetition had been wiped out, and all the verbiage had been wiped out, and it's all still in there. But understanding it and using it, of course, is probably taking a little bit more brain work than might have been the case when we had all these guidelines to set around. Then we have the local heritage control, apart from the legislation and English heritage support. Local authorities still have statutory responsibility for listed buildings in their patch, but they no longer have the money. I think something like a third of all conservation posts in the country are now full-time conservation posts are now gone. And what's left is a rather unsatisfactory mishmash of fairly amateur application of sometimes prejudice, sometimes simplistic understanding of buildings against proposals for what you do to them. Expertise is disappearing, and I'm not quite sure yet how that's going to be replaced. It may be that the private sector is going to need to be brought in to help the local authorities if there are enough architects, engineers, surveyors who understand historic buildings enough to assist in that process, then maybe that's where it's going to go. But the liability for that work is still going to be held by somebody, and also the funds are going to be needed from somewhere. And my suspicion is that that is going to be passed to the owners. At the moment you can make a free application for a change to a listed building. My suspicion is that cost is going to be applied to owners to make those applications, and they may even be required to hire somebody else in order to prepare the historic statement of significance. Not the applicant, because we seem to have a vested interest in change. But where that is going to go, anyone can tell. The moment money is shrinking all the time. The cultural value, if you like, of heritage protection has been taken away from the state and is being privatized. I think it's inexorable. And there are site values, the historic analysis, and the sources of all the information and so on. I'm sure you all know where to look for all those things. There are wonderful resources in every district, in the libraries and so on. The PRT itself's guide to writing conservation statement has a rather nice sort of series of illustrations of how you categorize the value of parts of the site in question. You've got to decide ruthlessly what is good, average, below average, and actually best removed. That's all part of this design process as well. So all of it leads up to actually finally designing the thing. I was asked to talk about principles, but I'm not sure. Principles are the thing. I want to throw away all the guidebooks, because I think it's important to be able to not just follow a guideline or tick boxes, but to understand the site that you're involved with so much, so well, that what you do to it rises naturally from that building or that setting. In other words, it's creativity and intensity of understanding. Maybe that's also a reason to revive the idea of the art, if you like, almost of patronage. You know, people who are commissioning people to work on buildings like this effectively are becoming patrons of the arts. And it would be wonderful to know that there is such a deep understanding of what that involves and what that requires, that it improves the way that we deal with these buildings. And design guides and box ticking can track an application through to approval in record time, but does it necessarily result in the best solution? I think we should be prepared to back originality if your gut feelings tell you that what the result will be is something special. And there are ways of breaking those rules. I think that can be illustrated in two examples that I know of. Not necessarily breaking those rules, but illustrating the way that understanding of what you're dealing with gives a better result. Both the examples happen to be in Oxford, where I come from, in two of the colleges. Architects among you will probably know St Catherine's College, which is Arne Jacobson's masterwork in the early 60s. And there's also Wadham College, which is basically medieval, but of course over the centuries has been added to, and each time in a way that was significant and of its period, if you like. But what you do, a place like St Catherine's wants to almost double in size without destroying the absolutely unified integrity of that single concept of Jacobson's, which ended up as that building. And Stephen Hodder, I think, so got under the skin of Jacobson's design and so completely understood his thought processes that when he resolved that into a new building, he somehow made that have its own integrity, but it was clearly the offspring from that original building. It wasn't pastiche in the sense of cut and paste, it wasn't a parody, it was simply an integrated design in its own right and beautifully related to its context. The other extreme in modern, which is a medieval college, including part of the old city wall, some Gothic buildings, some 1950s buildings, and in that setting, and also a 1960s icon in the Blackwell's music shop, which went out into the street. To bring that music shop into the college as a postgraduate centre and somehow relate it and integrate it with the medieval wall and the medieval buildings and the Victorian buildings and the 50s buildings. And Lee Fitzgerald, the architects there, I think did a masterwork of understanding all of that context and again weaving building into the new building into it in a way that looks, not that it's always been there, because it's clearly it is new building, but material choice, the hand-dressed stone, very crisp detailing of metalwork, you know, all those things, and some of the metalwork, the cladding, very much like some of the lead cladding on some of the other roofs and so on. All these things show that building to be growing out of that context rather than imposed on it. And I think that's the principle that one should always apply when building these contexts. So those of you that are doing projects like this and selecting your delivery teams, it is a question of finding who the best people are to do the work, whether it's architects or surveyors or engineers or anybody. Your whole team needs to be that kind of mindset. And you also need perhaps, I always try and suggest to clients an early partnership with the construction team, because what they can bring to the discussion can be just as valuable as what you can bring to it as designer. There's got to be that meeting of minds of thinking and making, which makes that whole process actually work. I think those are two sides of creativity, thinking and making. You cannot separate them, in my mind. And there's no need to be fashion victims. Some of the most extraordinary examples of 20th century architecture completely ignored current orthodoxy. A couple one can name, for example, St Mary's Church in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire, which in the 1920s, I think it was 1920s or 30s, is a most elaborate and delicious, pure Gothic confection. Those are the clients wanted. They got it. And another one, of course, is the completion of the tower on St Edmundsbury Cathedral in Bury St Edmunds, which is also a pure piece of Gothic. It was only finished in 2004. No reason to regard style as a moral issue of right and wrong. It's all a matter of taste and context and appropriateness, fashion, call it what you like. I think, as Ben was saying, we didn't collude on this. There is a time, I think, to re-examine the whole of architectural history and begin to let it inform the way that we still design, doesn't have to be extraordinarily expensive, high technology solutions to what are fundamentally simple problems. That also has a bearing on sustainability. If we build something to last hundreds of years rather than decades, most modern buildings actually have a design life of 60 years. That's how they're funded. That seems to me to be a colossal waste and something that has to be thought of as part of that design process. Contrast and innovation are arguably more honest, but who cares, frankly. The other thing I think that people commissioning buildings also need to know is not to be brainwashed, if you like, by their delivery team, but to actually get in on the process and actually understand what schedules of work mean and how they impact on actually the design and the cost and the running cost and maintenance and everything. And to understand the criteria that have been applied to the design proposals. With cash values, I always tell clients that the less spent on a historic building, the better for the building. There is nothing more sustainable or simple than an existing building used as simply as possible. They do not need big machines in them, big systems in them, in order simply to make them meet our needs for heat. You know, why is this room so damn hot? Why do we have to Why do we have to make these huge interventions in buildings to make them allegedly more usable, more lettable, or anything like that? For the simple reason that we want easy comfort. You know, it's so much simpler to wear more clothing than to put in more temperature. I don't understand why we just don't accept that all the time. And also, the same applies, I think, to the way buildings are procured. And I also always say that the lowest bid wins is not the way to secure a good building. It will simply, in my experience, secure an argument throughout the process while the builder tries to get the profit back. Find the people that deliver the building that you want and negotiate the right price. That's about it, really. There's no point in saying anything else.
Anyone has any questions for our speakers? Because we've heard a lot about different approaches, you know, how you deal with old and new. Is it prestige? Is it a contrast? How do we fit? How do we actually make sure that the building responds to what's around it? How do we engage everyone? From your experience, how do you find this issue of dealing with design and dealing with agencies like English Heritage or local authorities who are also providing an input into the design process? It would be interesting to hear from you.
I'm a conservation officer. I'm an architect, but I effectively work as a conservation officer in North Wales. I've been trying to save a listed hospital, grade 2 star, for 20 years. Jacobean style, set in just outside a Welsh market town, but effectively a rural setting. Tomorrow, I'm going to see proposals for from the Prince's Regeneration Trust for 13 acres of housing in a relatively discreet location by the hospital, which is going to be enabling developments which release capital to save the listed or part of the listed building. I know what my view is about what that housing should take on board in terms of its design approach, but I'd be interested to hear what the speakers would say about whether we should be having a sort of a small houndry next to the listed building, or whether we should be designing something more for the 21st century.
It completely depends on the setting and what's appropriate. You know, I think that there's a false notion that everything has to be of its time, because what is of its time, you know, most people in Britain, it's just a fact, prefer traditional housing. There are definitely places for a more contemporary solution, whatever contemporary is in a pluralist society. So I think I completely agree What you were saying, Robert, is a careful study of the place, working with people who have the languages of that place. So it's difficult if somebody doesn't understand the languages of the buildings they're working with, then of course they can only produce a solution that is a language they possess. So I think it's good to have multiple experts who spend as much time on site as possible together as a team, and then together the solutions should arise out of the place, rather than different disciplines being separated with a sort of prejudged notion of what they think out of their office is the right style.
Yeah.
So I'm really sorry I've got to run. But
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. And we have a question here.
I was just wondering, I was in charge of a project to renovate the Victorian Primary School, and we had a very combative relationship with our council. We didn't have a heritage officer. We didn't bother to bring a heritage officer in until they served a battery of planning enforcement notices against us, including things like considering original or considering 1980s fluorescent light fittings as an intrinsic part of the building's listed status, 14 infringements on that ground. So I'm just wondering how you say we deal with local authorities that really, from our perspective, as people who try to enable community buildings to happen, when they have those sort of levels of problems and unable to maybe even understand where you're coming from or what's actually the interest of the building itself.
Talk to Well, this maybe that relates to one of the last things I was saying, where in order to make an application for changes to a heritage building, it needs to be understood and explained. And maybe the application now is going to need, well, we do put in design access statements, sometimes design or heritage statements. But maybe it needs a little more. It needs that explanation of exactly what it is that's important about every part of that building, and whether there are things in it that have been added since its original date that want to be taken away, or whether they could be replaced in a more appropriate way. What the values are in terms of the qualities of the interior. You know, most grade 2 buildings, not that long ago, no one bothered about the inside. I think now the listing description means that everything is protected, and it's just the same whether it's 2, 2-star or 1. And the interior as well. That can be cause a problem for many people. But it is that statement of significance of each part of every building that will inform what can be done to it or what should be done to it. And I think that maybe it's going to be a raising the bar of how we deal with first the application or making the application before we get the reaction back. If you've got the tools to explain why you're doing it and why it should be this way, it will help in the decision making.
One of the issues I find as an architect and find in our practice is the almost completely random approach that different authorities take. And you can have a situation like yours in one local authority area and the conservation officer say, yeah, fine, understand it, get on and do it. And in another area, you'll have somebody digging their heels in and making keep 1980s light fittings in a Victorian building. So I think, strategically as a nation, we need to try and iron out some of those differences between, get a more consistent approach to the way we deal with historic buildings. But ultimately, they're about the people dealing with it and their ability to make objective rather than subjective judgments. And back what Rob said, in the case of Victorian School, a conservation statement should flag up very quickly what is, what's actually value and significance and what is peripheral. 1930s light fitting in a Jacobean building is not going to be nearly as significant as a 1930s light fitting in a Conall Ward Lucas building, which was put in when it was designed. So these things change, and it's another thing that frustrates me very much within our practice is people's lack of willingness to challenge those situations. Say, come on, you're being silly. Get away. You don't really want to keep the 1980s light fitting. You can have it if you want. Take it out for you. Give it to them. we are often too compliant, and too compliant with people who are not necessarily trained to make those decisions. Again, I think there's an area there that sometimes you have to take people to the edge and push them. The comfort example I showed you, the initiative wrote to the client saying, we are going to ask this to be called in, this application, if you do not change your design. And the client there, partly because they'd actually done a consultation process to which the SPAB, Georgian Group, Victorian Society, everybody bid along and got engaged in. And there was nobody else objecting to it. The client there decided to go ahead with it, let it go to plan. And there was great trepidation, because if it had not gone through planning and initiative called it in, the funding would have been lost altogether, and the project would have died. But they had the courage to do it, and they got the right answer, and the thing's nearly finished. So I don't know how you get over this randomness of approach, but you must follow your own beliefs, providing you're confident and your client's confident in the design decisions that have been collectively taken. I use that word collectively, very important, because you do not want any disparity of opinion and view between the client, the design team, the stakeholders when you're going for planning consent. If you build that alliance between the parties and you drive it through, you should get the right result. But it's never easy.